today we're going to be talking about Aaron's book, Egypt's Occupation, Colonial Economism and the Crisis of Capitalism, which was published by Stanford University Press just this past September. And Aaron Jakes is assistant professor of history at the New School for Social Research and the Eugene Lang College, where he teaches courses on the modern Middle East and South Asia, global environmental history, and the historical geography of capitalism. He's now working on two additional projects in addition to the one he's going to share with us today. One entitled The Fanatical Radical, The Life and Thought of Abdelaziz Jawish, which re-examines the long career of one of the most important creative political thinkers of the early 20th century. And the other is a much longer term project entitled Renting the Waters, about the Suez Canal and the production of global natures. It examines the long and complex history of the Suez Canal as a vantage from which to consider the changing role of rents in the history of global capitalism. He's going to be in conversation with Wael Gamal, who's an Egyptian economic journalist, columnist, and researcher. He has more than 18 years of experience in journalism and with local and international media. He was the El Arian Fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center, where his research focused on political economy in the region, the growing inequality gap, and the hollowing out of the middle class in the Arab world. Prior to that, he was the head of the Alternative Policy Solutions Project at the American University in Cairo. And before that, he was the chief editor of the alternative online news platform that we know and love, Meda Masr. He was also a founding member of the Arab Studies Institute's Political Economy Project at George Mason University in DC. And he's joining us from Cairo, so we're just so delighted. Thank you so much for agreeing to be in conversation with Aaron. Today, the two scholars will be in conversation, and Shana Marshall, who's our associate director, will be moderating. So you feel free to send her any questions that you have for the audience. And just before we start the formal event, I'd like to take a second to thank Christian Clinton, who's our operations manager, who takes care of all of the logistics, which are numerous despite the fact that we're not in person, online, and Elad Raymond, who helps with the publicity. So thank you to our staff for all the hard work that they do to make these events possible. And thanks for joining us. Shana, I'll let you, I forgot to mention, very important, which is Aaron has put a flyer in the chat, which offers 20% off his book. So you'll want to make sure to get your copy after this exciting event. With that, I think I'll pass the floor to Wael to start the conversation. Thanks.
If anyone, at any time, you can put your questions in the chat box. I will record those and give them to Aaron and Wael during the discussion. And then I think we're going to go ahead and move to Wael to help us open today's event. Thanks to you both. Wael, you're muted.
Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have been invited to this discussion of Aaron's very rich book about the occupation in Egypt and about the emergence of capitalism in Egypt. And I thank also the Institute for inviting me. One of the things that came to my mind when I first starting reading the book is what Thomas Piketty wrote about his capital in the 21st century, is that there is a gap between economics and history, and that gap usually goes without attention, and an area that economists don't see as part of their field, and historians don't see as part of their field either. And that book gave me the impression that it tackled this gap between a historian, which I'm not a historian, of course, and an economist that is looking into this void and getting lessons and ideas and insights from it through thorough research and insightful thinking. I understand that one of the most important themes of the book is the relation between the economic and the political. And today, it is the anniversary of the one of the most momentous days of the Egyptian Revolution, the 28th of January, the Friday of Anger, and during the revolution and afterwards, and maybe till this moment, there was this debate about the interaction between the social, economic, and political factors behind the revolution. And in many instances, there was that focus on the political kind of philosophical, generational aspects that led to what happened in 2011, and some neglect to the economic factors. In your book, there was the opposite, an ideological framework that concentrates totally on the Homo economicus and taking out of account the kind of that humans in a country like Egypt can really think more than their just economic needs, actual economic needs, and go beyond that to thinking about politics, about philosophy, about even imagining a new world. How do you see the evolution of this ideology in the beginning of the 20th century in Egypt?
Okay, thanks so much, Wael. And before I start, I want to thank Christian and Mona and Shana for organizing this event. And again, just to say, even in this weird electronic equivalent version, how much it means to me to be back at GW. I spent the year that I was finishing my dissertation sort of covertly at home at the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW, and then the following year on a postdoc, and really had space there to start putting this book together. So it really just means a tremendous amount to me to be here. And I guess coming at Wael's question, maybe one way to start is to kind of think about this prompt from Piketty in two directions as a way of describing a couple things that I was trying to deal with in the book. So the first has to do with the status of economics in the discipline of history and in histories of modern Egypt in particular. So on the one hand, one of the striking things about the literature on the modern history of Egypt is that it has actually been very important for understandings of a kind of broadly consolidated narrative about the economic history of the Middle East, and in some sense about the post-colonial world in particular. So I'm thinking here most significantly about the work of a figure like Roger Owen, but about a kind of broader set of narratives about Egypt's long-term peripheralization across the 19th century as a producer of raw cotton, or even a kind of nationally scaled plantation of cotton for European mills. And at the time that literature was written in the 1960s and early 1970s, its authors were deeply invested in the project of decolonization, and making these kinds of arguments about these features of Egypt's economic underdevelopment were quite central to political arguments that they were trying to make in the present about what kinds of things would be necessary and possible to improve people's livelihoods in Egypt, and about why, in response in particular to modernization theory, dominant explanations for rates of poverty, industrial underdevelopment, political form were inadequate to explaining what was going on. So on the one hand, the historiography of modern Egypt is sort of unusual in that there is a body of work on economic history that is actually really important to how subsequent generations of historians have understood what was happening. But in a sense, that narrative became so well established that it made it possible to start treating economic history as a kind of static background to all sorts of other things that were taking place. So if you look at any number of the really wonderful monographs on Egyptian history that were written in subsequent generations, you'll almost always find kind of concise synopsis of Owen's argument as part of the background that then makes it possible to not talk about anything related to economic history moving forward. So there's a kind of interesting way in which that kind of earlier generation of work enabled an abandonment of economic history. And in the course of that abandonment led to a sort of weird paradox of how a lot of more recent scholarship on colonialism in Egypt, and again, more broadly, deals with the global history of capitalism. So on the one hand, critical analyses of capitalism now, and actually, I mean, critical and affirming analyses of capitalism often emphasize as one of its distinguishing features its extraordinary dynamism, crisis tendencies, volatility, creative production of new goods. And so on the one hand, we have an analytic attached to a category that is understood to be characterized by dynamic historical change. And yet the kind of central feature of the narrative of economic history that we have about Egypt is all about stasis. So basically, beginning in the 19th century, the modernizing regime of Mehmed Ali and his heirs undertakes a set of decisions to convert Egyptian agriculture to the cultivation of cotton for export. And this essentially locks in place a set of structural economic relations on a global scale that are understood not to have changed really at all until Gamal Abdel Nasser came along in the 1950s. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when I started the research, and I started the research for this project in 2007 as the financial crisis was getting going, was this kind of mismatch between my own experiences of the like weird, eventful, crisis-inducing dynamism of capitalism, and a way of writing its history that seemed to completely evacuate that sort of eventfulness. And when I started looking at sources from this period, it immediately became striking that particularly the Egyptian commentators that I was reading were themselves captivated by that kind of dynamism, and were describing a set of changes that were not very well accounted for by the old narrative about cotton. And so one part of the book, the kind of central chapters of the book, is centrally concerned with telling the story of Egypt's emergence as a laboratory for new kinds of financial institutions and a target for foreign financial investment. And then thinking about how those changes figured in a whole set of political developments related to the rise of nationalism as a coherent political movement. So that's sort of one version of the putting history back into conversation with economics. The second point, which relates partly to the latter part of Wael's comment, has to do with the inability of mainstream economics as it exists right now to grapple seriously and critically with its own history as a discipline. So my kind of central argument characterizing what the British were up to in Egypt is organized around this concept of colonial economism. This is the idea that most Egyptians, as racially distinctive human subjects, were capable of no more and no less than a bare recognition of their own economic interests, or as Wael put it quite nicely, that this is a group of people who are kind of actually homo economicus in their daily comportment, and not capable of thinking beyond their economic interests in a way that would sustain the sort of collective deliberation over public interest and kind of forward-looking planning for other aspects of social development that is the real stuff of politics. Now, what's striking about this, and potentially problematic for the self-understanding of economics as a discipline, is that this discourse in British rule in Egypt actually emerges out of a kind of long through line of concern and debate and preoccupation among all the leading figures of classical political economy about how to understand the relationship between a domain of economic stuff that they were trying to make sense of and everything that was not economic. And so the early part of the book traces a kind of an intellectual history within political economy of efforts to grapple with that that problem, and notes in particular that ideas about race and civilizational hierarchy became, for many of these important figures, a sort of lazy solution to the problem. So that even before a figure like Cromer arrives in Egypt, someone like John Stuart Mill has basically solved this problem of how to think about the relationship between economics and politics by suggesting that economic rationality represents a kind of lower level of civilizational development than politics, in such a way that classical political economy could hold true in places like Egypt and India, but liberal political theory that allowed collectivities of ordinary people to govern themselves could not. And so a different way of putting this is that I understand this part of the book to be one small contribution to a kind of larger project of critical reconsideration of the history of economics and its long and problematic relationship to ideas about race, racism, civilizational hierarchy. Now, how that relates to what happened in Egypt in 2011 and what's happening now, I mean, I guess one last thing to say is that one of the things that sort of changed as I was turning my dissertation into the book was the advent of figures like Sisi, like Modi in India, like Trump, all of whom in various ways, are kind of progenitors of overtly racist ideologies that are engineering forms of political exclusion and are centrally preoccupied with notions about the ability of certain kinds of economic indicators to basically serve as proxies for popular opinions. And so I have been struck by the kind of long resonance of these ideas about the economic determination of political behavior, basically as a way of making claims to the political exclusion of large sectors of various national populations from political life. And so, thinking about 2011, I think to the extent that a lot of the analyses were trying to make kind of either or arguments about, like, this is really a movement of poor people who are concerned about the Aish part of Aish Hurriya, as opposed to the other parts, were missing the point, which I would suggest is that actually, if we look at the history of popular political mobilizations over a long arc of time, in many instances, they entail kind of practical refusals of these sorts of separations. And so the working groups that appear in the later chapters of my book, Going on Strike, understood the demands that they were making and their collective actions not just to be ways of gaining higher wages, but actually of making claims to forms of political participation that had been withheld from them, which they understood also to have direct implications on their material conditions of well-being. And so, yeah, we might think about this as a history that also kind of guides us toward rejecting those one-sided deterministic ways of thinking about something like 2011.
You started thinking about the book in 2007, just before the financial meltdown in 2007, 2008. But there was another meltdown you're referring to in the book in 1907, and before that there was the influx of finance into Egypt under the ideology that Cromer has outlined, depending on the ruling Egypt through giving economic motivations to poor peasants. But you tend to give a huge importance to this period, the first decade of the 20th century, as even saying that it made what happened afterwards not a continuation of the traditional cotton economy referred to by many of the historians. Can you explain why is that?
Sure. And this may seem like a weird tangent off your question, but just thinking about, I mean, this morning I was thinking about some version of this question that you might ask in the moment that we're living through today. And so one first thing to say about the significance of the financial crises of 1907 in relation to the moment that we're living through right now is that although Egypt was one place that was particularly hard hit, it was not the only one. So there was a kind of worldwide pattern of financial crises. Probably the best known was in the United States, but there were problems in Germany and Japan and Chile and many parts of the world. And we might think about one aspect of the political significance of these crises in that moment in terms of the way awareness of the global character of those crises made possible kinds of comparison that allowed groups of people in one country or another basically to assess how their governments were doing. So one of the reasons why this financial crisis was politically significant for critics of British rule in Egypt was that they were aware that there were similar financial crises happening in other parts of the world. And at least as they understood what was taking place, that governments in those other places had actually intervened to do something about those problems in ways that the British-controlled government of Egypt had not. So the kind of awareness of a common experience made possible certain kinds of comparisons that were significant, right? And I think we might consider how the globally patterned character of the pandemic that we're living through is enabling, and I think should enable, similar kinds of comparisons, right? The fact that the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, represents a quarter of coronavirus cases is a really damning statistic that is made possible by the fact that we have statistics on coronavirus cases from all around the world. Now, explaining how things got there. Right. So one of the implications of the idea that Egyptians, even Egyptian peasants, possessed a kind of a basic economic rationality. And this is an idea that Cromer brings with him out of a set of debates that had already been taking place in India from at least the 1870s, is that it meant for Cromer and his supporters that forms of credit extended to small farmers, whether in the Egyptian countryside or elsewhere, were likely to be used used in a rational way as farm credit and not simply squandered on frivolous expenditure. And so on the basis of this idea, beginning in the mid-1890s, the Egyptian government undertook a series of experiments that culminated in the establishment of an agricultural bank that we really might think of as kind of one of the global progenitors of what today we would describe as microfinance. So the idea was that private capital would fund a bank that would receive a series of special concessions from the Egyptian government, namely guaranteed returns on the capital invested in the bank and use of government tax collectors to service its loans. So the risk to investors is reduced and the costs to the business are reduced to facilitate these loans. And the idea is that this will make it possible to channel financial capital from Europe directly into loans to poor Egyptian farmers in the countryside. The bank was incredibly successful, but actually much less significant to what subsequently happened than the British would have liked to imagine. Or less significant in the ways that Cromer and his buddies had thought. So in setting up the bank, the government had to undertake a whole series of studies to generate data about rates of indebtedness all across the country, about the value of land all across the country. This meant that there were growing cohorts of English-speaking officials who actually knew how to make those calculations and knew about that kind of data. And the published availability of that data and the existence of that cohort of people, coupled with a set of legal reforms that meant that loan contracts in Egypt were very secure relative to loan contracts in many other parts of the world, meant that by the late 19th century, Egypt could become a very appealing target for foreign financial investment. And most of the banks that were set up in this period actually decided that even with the incentives that the agricultural bank was offering, they would prefer to lend their money to the wealthiest landowners in the country who were easier to deal with. It meant that they were administering fewer loans. It meant that their properties were easier to assess. And there's a crucial feature of the dynamics of this financial market itself that kind of fed this class inequality and how the lending was happening. So the more banks there were making these loans, the more eager they all were to lend their money as quickly as possible, because they were aware that the growing supply of money was going to cause prevailing interest rates on their loans to fall. And so this meant that, particularly in the early years of the 1900s, there was this wild race between a whole bunch of new mortgage banking institutions to lend as much money as they could, as quickly as they could, on the largest properties they could. So on the one hand, this means that a process of financialization that the British had claimed was going to alleviate forms of inequality in the countryside actually ended up amplifying them quite dramatically. And it meant that the banks, as their interest rates started to fall, needed to look for other ways of lending money to juice their returns. And so they started dabbling in more and more creative and risky forms of investment, many of them akin to what we would now describe as derivatives. So the most common of these was to make loans against the stock certificates of companies. And this was possible because stock certificates at the time were revenue-bearing instruments. They offered dividends, and so you could calculate interest against a stock certificate. But that meant, on the one hand, that there's a kind of increasing abstraction to the character of financial investment. It also meant that stock market values were being inflated because stocks themselves had this alternative use, not as representatives of the kind of underlying valuation of the companies that they capitalized, but as instruments for borrowing money. And eventually this business became so profitable that many of these banks started borrowing on renewable short-term credit to make loans of indefinite or longer duration against stock certificates. And so you basically had a financial bubble that was dependent upon a regular supply of cheap short-term credit. And starting at the end of 1906, partly because the Bank of England and a bunch of other banks had to make massive payments on fire insurance policies to San Francisco because of the San Francisco earthquake of the spring of 1906, and actually partly because Egypt in 1906 had its most valuable cotton crop ever until that point. The Bank of England raised its discount rate, the interest rate on which it discounted bills of exchange, which functioned as the kind of calibrating benchmark interest rate according to which all other interest rates on British financial markets were pegged. And that threw these arrangements out of whack. And so both in the United States and in Egypt and in various other places, these kind of weird leveraged financial instruments started to fall apart. And I guess the last thing I'll say before I pass it back to Wael is that in placing these events kind of in the central of the book, I am not suggesting that this financial crisis then caused economic hardship that generated like a new population of angry, hungry people who angrily went marching through the streets. In fact, what was significant was that the kind of economic dislocation that was caused by this crisis posed a set of serious problems for a colonial regime that had pegged its own legitimacy to its own chosen metrics of economic growth and development, which were suddenly not doing very well. And more significantly, it made it possible for critics of this economistic discourse of colonial rule to start making all sorts of new and interesting arguments about how absurd it was to claim that the economic and the political were separate or existed in this kind of straightforward causal relationship to each other. And the kinds of comparisons that I was alluding to earlier were kind of central to their ways of doing so.
It is surprising to me that even the language that was used in 1907 at the beginning of the 20th century is very similar to the language of 2007 when we speak about financial engineering, mortgage-backed loans, and that kind of activities, speculative activities, and all that. And I when I was working on the tax havens issue, I discovered that the first company that really invented the idea of tax haven was established in 1904, and it was the Egyptian Company for Land Limited, and it's a British company that transferred its headquarters to Cairo, and then refused to pay taxes in the UK. And then after, I think in 1929, there was that court ruling that gave them this right not to pay taxes in Britain, and the loophole was created then that opened the door for all the tax havens we see now in the world, and turned the Britain to one of the financial paradises of the modern era. And I want to go to a chapter we were talking about just before the session. You wrote, and Ahmed Shukr lately, and you put the title Capitalism in Egypt and not Egyptian capitalism. And what I understood was that in addition to the tension between the economic and political and the interdependence that we see in the history of Egypt, there is also a tension between the external and the internal. And capitalism in Egypt gives a room to think about not only the external factors of the development of modern capitalism in the history of Egypt, but also the internal factors and social conflict, Egyptian groups and social groups that and their role in what's going. And one of the consequences of the crisis in 1907 was a change in the ideologies and thinking of the national movements in Egypt. Maybe this was one of the things leading to the revolution in 1919, or you don't think so?
So, okay, so let me, I'll mull the 1919 question. I have, I think, well, sorry, I'll start there. So I think that it is quite helpful and important relative to the way that the events of 1919 are often described, to think about a kind of a longer set of trajectories in which the years between 1907 and 1910 were particularly important. So for a whole variety of reasons, partly related to this financial crisis, partly related to the kind of opening that was created by political mobilization around the Dinshui incident of 1906, right? This is an event in which the British deliberately and quite dramatically overreacted to an altercation in a village in the province of Minufia between some peasants and some British soldiers who were hunting the pigeons that the peasants had been raising for food. And a British soldier died as a result of this altercation. And the British responded by staging a very rapid trial under a form of exceptional law, which led to the executions and whippings of many of these villagers in the village that they lived in front of their families, in a way that I think, like, as many times as I had read about this, like early on as a student of Middle Eastern history, I didn't actually understand this until I don't know, I was writing the last version of that chapter of the book. Anyway, so there are a collection of events, some in Egypt. Also important here is the Ottoman Constitutional Revolution of 1908, which was interpreted much more radically by many ordinary people in other parts of the Ottoman world than it was by the Committee for Union and Progress itself. All of these things contribute to a massive surge of political activism in Egypt in this 3-ish year period from 1907 to 1910. And part of what I'm trying to emphasize in the chapter of the book that deals with those events is that for many of the actors involved in this activism, which assumes the form of lots of strikes, many by unlikely groups of people, the most striking of which is the students of the Azhar, dramatic proliferation of new kinds of political associations, proliferation of new forms of media, new newspapers, and efforts by a proliferation of political parties, and an effort by those parties to kind of make direct connections to popular groups toward which they had generally been quite disdainful until that moment. What's striking about what happens a decade later in 1919 is that many of the first groups to mobilize when the protests began after the members of the Weft were deported in March of 1919 were exactly the same groups that had been most active in this earlier moment. There are several reasons why I think this is significant. For me, foremost among them is that there is an explanation for 1919 that seems for various reasons to have become resurgent in recent years, that basically tries to claim that there is a kind of elite middle class legalistic movement around Saad Zaghloul that is primarily concerned with Egypt's kind of formal legal status in the new society of nations that is taking shape after the war. And then there is a peasant insurgency that is not nationalist, has completely different origins, and is usurped by these legalistic middle-class figures. And that argument often tends to rest on a profoundly economistic understanding of what the peasants were up to in ways that are often weirdly blind to the ways in which that argument is already present in the colonial archive that they are reading. In other words, the most confusing thing about 1919 for the British was that there were large numbers of peasants in the countryside suddenly taking up arms against British rule. They had deemed this unthinkable for decades. And their explanation was, well, this is not really nationalism. It's not really politics. The issue is that economic conditions during the war were really awful. We pushed the peasants too hard. We took too many of their crops. We stole too many of their livestock. We forced them to perform all sorts of horrible labor. This was necessary. It's bad. But none of this adds up to real politics. It's actually just a kind of reaction against these bad conditions. And if one thinks about the events of 1919 in relation to this longer history, we can know that there were already existing connections between political movements in the city and groups of people in the countryside, that there were already ideas circulating about why a nation state might be appealing even to peasants in the countryside. And this gets to the kind of latter part of your question, which is that I think it can be helpful to see the history of nationalism containing multiple and in some ways really contradictory possibilities. So nationalism historically was the vector through which growing numbers of Egyptians were involved in new forms of politics in this period. And for many of those people, that involvement opened up the possibility of more equitable distributions of wealth, more equitable distributions of power, more active forms of political participation. And it is also the case that the kind of idea of the nation state and plans for how it was going to be kind of rescaled out of imperial architectures often ended up making it quite possible for groups of technocratic elites to claim that the political demands of those ordinary people needed to be subordinated. And this is basically where the last chapter of the book lands, is that while also enabling these new forms of popular politics, the financial turmoil of the first decade of the 20th century also gave tremendous weight to a new argument that meaningful independence would require the establishment of pools of national capital that could circulate within Egypt's borders and would make the country less dependent on foreign loans, less susceptible to the volatility of financial markets. And basically the leading figures of economic nationalism, figures like Talat Harb and Yusuf Nahas, start to make arguments that the kind of needs and demands of other groups had to be subordinated to that collective project of national capital formation. And I think it's quite helpful to think about these as kind of possibilities that existed together and could tug in different directions. The last thing to say just about where you started and the title of that chapter I wrote with Ahmed Shukr is that it was intended most directly as a response to a growing literature on something that calls itself the new history of American capitalism. And often when we as scholars of the Middle East are responding to our colleagues who work on other parts of the world, we end up dealing with forms of exceptionalism, right? The most obvious of which here is that there's something like analytically meaningful that can be called American capitalism. And so in writing that chapter, we were sort of trying to think and write through a history of capitalism in Egypt that would be consistent with our skepticism toward the idea that there are kind of national types of capitalism that exist in other places.
um, one of the things you analyzed in the book is the concerning the colonial, what you call the colonial economism. What was the idea that giving benefits to the small poor peasants will work as generating legitimacy for the occupation. And the idea was very similar to the idea of SMEs. Give them finance, they will have the motivation to grow their crops, and then the production will be more, and then they will happy about life under occupation. It didn't work. And then the social alliance that at least intended for the occupation changed, but the landowners that came out under the banner of Al-Wafd, then they had their problems with the British occupation. How do you see the relation between those, and especially with the growing inequalities in the Egyptian countryside because of the changing of the paradigm, the ideological paradigm that you just described?
Yeah, I mean, right. So, I mean, so this is kind of the foremost manifestation of the tension I was just talking about. So, right, within Egyptian historiography about the period of Egyptian history that I'm writing about, the kind of most common paradigm is that of the Ayn Shams school, which basically emphasizes the role and power of the large landholding class across the 19th century and again into the 1950s, and basically sees British rule as a kind of alliance of convenience with that class. So on the one hand, some of the work that I'm trying to do in the early chapters of the book is to offer some challenges to that narrative, both because the British themselves were overwhelmingly critical of the class of large landholders that they found when they arrived, and because once you start dealing with actual histories of nationalist thought, and I think this is true kind of more broadly with like histories of political thought generally, it's actually pretty difficult to map people's ideas and positions onto their class location in any kind of like really consistent and meaningful way, at least on one level. So I mean, one of the tensions that I'm trying to deal with, and frankly, I'm not entirely satisfied with how the last chapter of the book deals with this, but it is between a kind of broadly shared analysis of what the problems were by the opening decades of the 20th century, right? And so part of the issue there is that the claim that the large landholding class was an obstacle to industrial development gets matters wrong because it assigns to actors at the time an understanding of the problems that they were trying to grapple with that were not the problems that they were trying to grapple with. In other words, a figure like Talab Harb did write about industrialization, but industrial underdevelopment was not his primary concern. Like many of his contemporaries, he was chiefly worried about the country's reliance on foreign finance, about the forms of volatility that introduced. And he, like many of his contemporaries, actively affirmed Egypt's role as a producer and exporter of raw cotton as a kind of necessary component of the project of national economic development that he he was hoping to pursue. And that ends up meaning that some of what I think has been explained in terms of class position is also describing a set of structural problems that projects of national development in the colonial world encountered almost everywhere, which was that economies that had been kind of engineered as export economies ended up in projects of national development having very few options for like getting out of those arrangements outside of doubling down on some level on the economic model that they were trying to escape from. And so one of the kind of puzzling, uncomfortable things that ends up happening is that there were figures who could, on the one hand, write about the extreme economic ravages of colonial rule and what they were doing to the livelihoods of peasants in the countryside, and at the same time insist that those peasants needed to continue farming large amounts of cotton, conforming to a set of government regulations that were fundamentally exploitative in their ways of dealing with agricultural labor, and kind of subsumed those claims under an idea that for a time doing those things would help to generate this pool of capital that would eventually make it possible for people to do other things. And thinking forward, and here I think there may be kind of interesting connections to matters that you know much better than I do. These problems become much, much worse after World War I, basically with the demise of the British gold standard. So the other peculiarity of the 19th century is that no one really needs to worry about the value of money, and there were not yet national monies. And at the point at which national monies start to have very different values that fluctuate in relation to each other, the problem of exports also then becomes directly tied to the problem of monetary sovereignty, the valuation of national currencies. And so in many ways, in a world in which currency values are not all kind of fixed tightly to each other, this kind of reliance on extractive forms of either agricultural or in other places like mining and mineral extraction for export that end up leading to really awful living conditions for working people across much of the post-colonial world actually become that much more important to many of the plans of national economic development that have to generate currency surpluses in order to kind of deal with the trajectories of national development that they're trying to pursue on a global scale. That was a kind of meandering answer to your question, but there you have it.
Well, if you can have maybe one more question, and then we'll move on to the audience questions in about 6 minutes.
Yeah, you just said that the big landowner class was not an obstacle to industrial development. One of the things that Tariq al-Bishri, for example, puts as one of the reasons behind what happened in 1952 was exactly that it was one of the prerequisites of industrial development of Egypt is creating a market for the industrial production consumers, and that a certain balance of power that in the countryside of Egypt was an obstacle to doing that. So it was very difficult for the land-owning class to reform land in a way that permits the proper development of industry. Do you agree?
My last question is that you were saying that your
arguments of the book. So can you tell us what exactly the ideas you're rethinking?
Sure. So, I mean, I should be clear. I do think, it's pretty hard to argue that certainly by the 1940s, that there was not a large landholding class that exercised an incredible degree of political influence, monopolized resources in the countryside, and was exploiting the bejesus out of their tenant farmers all over the country. This is, I mean, one of the things that Ahmed Shukr and I have been working on together is to kind of think about what it would, I mean, if one thinks about one version of this narrative as a kind of backward projection of Nasserist ideology to justify the land reforms in the 1950s, then it might be that the social conditions that the land reform were trying to address emerged in different ways at a different time than that narrative would suggest, and that can lead to different possibilities and different forms of analysis of various kinds. And so I think we would both suggest that the Great Depression was sort of decisive in locking into place the social conditions that were the kind of real target of a lot of early free officers era policies, more than a kind of deliberate class alliance with the British earlier on. But the other thing about the Nasserist narrative is that, I mean, some versions of it, including El-Bishri's, tends to use this critique of the large landholding class to direct attention away from the very limited character of actual agrarian reform that occurred under Nasser. And I think more interesting is the question of sort of what relationships between the countryside and the city actually needed to look like in the 50s and 60s to sustain the project of economic development that the new regime was pursuing. And in many ways, they reimposed state control over agrarian production in ways that were not structurally not that different from some of the things that the Mehmet Ali regime had done in the 1820s. And in many ways, livelihoods in the countryside were being used to subsidize the wages of industrial workers and civil servants in the city. And so there were various ways in which continued exploitation of the countryside, despite the political obstacle of the large landholding class, remained a kind of necessary feature of this project of economic development. But the other thing, and this is something we deal with quite extensively in that chapter, is that Nasser's sort of genius as a manipulator of international relations meant that Egypt was able to rely on multiple forms of rents to subsidize the things that the government was doing in ways that were, I think, quite distinctive to that moment. And the quick, short answer to your last question is, I'm now sort of getting underway with some of this work on this new project on the Suez Canal, and have been looking at debates around a proposal to extend the canal concession by another 40 years from 1968 to 2008 that were put forward around 1908. And one of the things that's really jumped out of those negotiations is the degree to which Egypt's residual status as a part of the Ottoman Empire was quite decisive in creating all sorts of opportunities for foreign finance, and that in some ways the enduring Ottomanness of Egypt actually ended up in this way contributing to Egypt's incorporation into the kinds of Eurocentric financial relationships that the book is describing. So I touch on this very, very briefly in the introduction, but the arrangements governing Egyptian state finance after the bankruptcy of 1876 meant that the Egyptian state could not directly borrow money without permission from the Ottoman Sultan. We can think about a whole sequence of subsequent developments as efforts to fund various projects under conditions in which direct public borrowing of the kind in which the Egyptian state had engaged prior to its bankruptcy was not on the table. So the role of private finance in all the different sorts of enterprises that the book is describing was understood by the British, at least in part, as a consequence of a situation in which the state could not undertake certain kinds of projects because it couldn't borrow money, but private actors could. And so Egypt basically becomes, in that sense, a laboratory for like the private financing of what otherwise might have been like public projects. One of the more dramatic examples of this is the first Swan Dam, where Cassell arranges this very bizarre set of workarounds to this borrowing arrangement, where the Egyptian government is effectively borrowing money to build the dam, but has to do so by transferring pay warrants to a company that then purchases them. And the effect of all of this is basically that Cassell and his cronies are lending money to the Egyptian government at much higher rates of interest than they would have if the government could simply borrow directly. And this Suez Canal concession agreement, which eventually fell through, is a version of something similar. So I've been kind of thinking about how the political status of Egypt as still sort of Ottoman actually figures into this history of finance in ways that I might have emphasized differently had I written the book now rather than when I did.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, Wael, for all those really wonderful questions. We do have 3 questions already, so I'll ask them one at a time because they are actually quite distinct, and it would probably be difficult, Aaron, for you to keep them all in your mind at once. So this comes from Relly Schechter, and she asks, could you say more about the notion of experiment in British administrative speak? Was this part of making colonial economism more scientific, or were the results of those experiments to be exported elsewhere, and how? So I think maybe your terminology is, experiment is your terminology, right? Not necessarily British. Oh, okay, great, wonderful. So that's an excellent question. Then I'm very interested to hear the answer to that as well. So please.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. So no, it is one of the more striking features of these colonial sources that almost every significant policy that the British undertook in Egypt, they described as an experiment. And so this question, I think, is exactly the question to ask of this. Like, if this is an experiment, then like, what is the data? What is it trying to prove? Where will this this knowledge go? And kind of both of the possibilities that that you lay out in this question are operative here. So on the one hand, I understand the language of experiment to be speaking to the kind of unsettled and contested nature of theories of colonial rule in this moment at the end of the 19th century. So if we think about British rule in India as particularly important for many of the figures who arrived in Egypt, then we can identify a kind of pretty long period in the first half of the 19th century where a certain kind of liberal universalism reigned supreme. The idea there was that a place like England could serve as the model for what a place like India could become, and the responsibility of the colonial government, therefore, was to kind of train up populations to do the sorts of things that people in England could do, right? The Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Education is a kind of classic exemplar of this kind of thinking. And that liberal vision was really in crisis, certainly after 1857, after the Indian uprising, and as it related to economic thought, also after the Deccan riots of 1875. This is a relatively small set of events that assumes huge importance for colonial officials in India, where a bunch of peasants basically attacked the homes and in some cases persons of the moneylenders who held their debt. And so this raised all sorts of questions about agricultural credit indebtedness. And so there are different ways of thinking about what that debate was about. But for many of the figures I'm looking at, because of the influence of various iterations of racial and civilizational thought, it ends up turning on disagreements about the character of colonial subjects themselves. So one way of understanding many of these experiments is basically, if we do X, can we learn more about how these people will behave? So if we extend them credit, will they in fact prove themselves to be the economically rational figures that we believe that they are, or will they go off and do a variety of other things? And the way that this plays out in the trajectory of the book itself is that, in fact, when things start to go wrong after 1907, and one of the features of the financial crisis that the British are very reluctant to acknowledge until they have no choice but to do so, is that it has particularly pernicious effects for smallholding farmers. So by 1910, something like 50,000 of the agricultural bank's clients are in arrears. And because this version of the discourse of experiment understood the experiments to be experiments that are generating information about what these people are like, the conclusion is not, oh, there's something about our understanding of agrarian finance and political economy more generally that we need to rethink, but rather, oh, we've misjudged these peasants as human subjects. They cannot be trusted to use credit in a rational and responsible way. And therefore, we need to go with a kind of different mode of colonial rule. So the reason why the 7th chapter of the book is called Punjab on the Nile is that basically what starts to happen as the occupation's plans unravel is a quite concerted shift away from a certain kind of residual liberal optimism, at least about the possibilities of applying liberal political economy in Egypt, to a more consistently conservative position that basically says these people are fundamentally different, and therefore the state needs to intervene to kind of protect and in some cases coerce them to act in their own interests because they cannot otherwise be trusted to do so. The other part of your question was about the kind of applicability of the data of the experiments, and here Egypt is also quite important. So one of the things that starts to happen, again, I think precisely because of this experimental discourse, is that Egypt comes to be seen as a potential alternative model to a place like India for how colonial rule can work. So Teddy Roosevelt's government, when they need to start figuring out what they're going to do with the Philippines, ends up sending people to Egypt to study what Cromer's regime has been doing. The Japanese become totally fascinated with what Cromer is doing in Egypt, and actually in a way that becomes quite awkward for some of the nationalists in 1908, many members of the technocratically inclined positivist Committee for Union and Progress in the Ottoman Empire proper are also quite infatuated with what the British are doing and have all sorts of positive things to say about the model of colonial development that the British have imposed. So while the nationalists have been kind of pinning their hopes on their relationship to the Ottoman Empire for some time, after the Constitutional Revolution, the British are very amused that they now have to deal with a government that is actually kind of much more in favor of the occupation as a model of good government.
Wonderful, thank you so much. The second question comes from Atif Saeed. He says, thanks to both of you for this great discussion. He's got to pop into another event, so this is going to be a quick one. One of the interesting things that came to his mind is what ways we understand notions of the internal and external in complicated ways. So he's referring to Wael's question about the 1919 revolution and then Aaron's response to that question. The book seems to present a novel reading on Egyptian economics while also situating it in a transnational lens. Many historians and historically oriented social scientists still operate within methodologically nationalist frameworks. So if we think of Wael's question and Aaron's response about 1919 and the nationalist economic projects, this perhaps gives us an interesting lens for reading 1919 and its aftermath. For example, the economic nationalization elite, who were anti-colonialist and also revolutionary in 1919, could be seen as also counter-revolutionary in relation to the peasant movements of 1919. So can you elaborate maybe on that internal, external element in your book?
Can I actually, I really want to hear more from Wael about his work on tax havens, and I think this might be another way to kind of come at this. So, I mean, Wael, would you be willing to kind of come at this question based on work that you've been doing about kind of what happens after 1919, and I mean, we could think about taxes as a kind of quintessential issue of this external-internal relation. And as I understand it, right, your question around tax havens had to do with the ways in which kind of lumpy legal geographies also create opportunities for capital to kind of move in and around various kinds of national structures. So you should feel free to say no, but because I've been blabbering and I'm really interested in what you're doing, I kind of want to pass this one to you.
I'm not taking the discussion back to the 21st century, but maybe you can comment on this also. One of the, I think, the theories about, for example, the emergence of the Talat Harb project was that it was not really a nationalistic and the totally nationalistic, and it had to deal with the facts of the international capitalism situation. So it was not wholly Egyptian. There was shareholders, foreign shareholders in the project from the beginning, and it had to deal, as you mentioned, for example, the cotton economy, with the facts of the cotton economy and situation of Egypt in the world division of production, and but this has consequences for even the liberal nationalist tradition of Egypt, that it's not really. It's part of the economic liberalism attachment to the world. Now we see the after the revolution in 2011, we have seen liberals that usually focus on the same ideas that you mentioned in Kromer's plan for Egypt: attraction of foreign investment, Egypt as an honest repair of debt responsibilities, easing finance for the poor and transforming them into entrepreneurs. They're part of the international capitalist project, and in its new liberal even version. I'm not sure what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your way of describing a figure like Harb kind of nicely threads a kind of tension that, I mean, again, this is something that my colleague Ahmed Shokr and I have been thinking a lot about, right? I mean, the old version that gets Talat Harb a square in downtown Cairo has him as a kind of proto-Nasserist champion of national capital and industrialization. And then we have in the English language literature, the kind of Eric Davis version of that, in which that's basically what he's after, and he gets thwarted by colonialism. Then there's the Bob Vitalis revision to this, which notices the very thing that you're pointing out, right? Which is that Harb is engaging closely with foreign actors of various kinds. His business enterprises are never wholly national. They are reliant on foreign capital. He is perfectly comfortable interacting with and dealing with all sorts of outside actors. And where we think that Vitalis might take things a little bit too far is that on that basis, he basically treats Harb's nationalism really as like a cynical marketing strategy. And so the suggestion is that there ultimately is not very much difference between Aboud Pasha and Talat Harb. As capitalists, they simply have adopted slightly different strategies for kind of how to navigate the discursive fields of their moment. And where I think that takes things a bit too far is that I think it's actually possible to see, I mean, like in the book, I do not regard Harb as a creative thinker at all. Like part of what's striking is that the things that he's writing, certainly in the period that I look at, he's not the first to write about them. He often does not have the most interesting arguments on their behalf. He's very much like working in the soup of ideas of his moment. But those ideas were compelling to large numbers of people for a reason, and I think it's possible to see the promise of a kind of national rescaling of economic life as really meaningful to large numbers of people, like Harb, but like lots of other people, for pretty good reason, and at the same time recognize that they were like navigating a set of structural constraints that actually made the versions of how they were supposed to behave like basically impossible. Now, I think we can also see him as a capitalist who was like, this is the other point, right? There are possible critiques of capitalism available in this moment that many of these figures reject. So many of the figures who are advancing a vision of national capital development are doing so while explicitly rejecting the idea of socialism and revolution. They actually understand nationalism, at least in part, as a way of forestalling a set of more radical possibilities. And we can certainly see a figure like Harb as participating in that kind of political project. But it's sort of hard to imagine what any version of the kind of business enterprise he was undertaking would have looked like that would not require him to be engaging actively with foreign capital all along the way.
Should I move on to the next question? Wael, do you have anything to add? Okay. Okay, so this question comes from Sylvia Marsan Sakli, and she says, thank you for this refreshing set of perspectives on colonial finance. You made this distinction between how colonial sources are surprised or reluctant to read peasant action as political as opposed to merely reactive. Maybe this is more of a theoretical question, but can you say more about what, in your view, makes peasant responses political? What is the political with regard to peasant action or mobilization? Is it an understanding of the system and their place in it? Is it intentionality? Is it acting in their own self-interest? Why would that be surprising?
Yeah, this is a great question, which I am still grappling with, but I'll give you like a version of the answer that lives inside the book. So, and I'll offer a little bit more background here. So another thing that I was thinking about sort of when I started working on this project was the degree to which, although a kind of anti-imperialist or anti-colonial position still carries considerable political cachet and normative force in Egypt, that there is strikingly little emphasis on the ways in which the period of actual colonial rule was formative in the country, particularly for its political institutions, in ways that have really enduring legacies. And one of the examples of this that I find most significant, and that actually was foremost in my mind in the events of 2011, was the really concerted effort of the British to shut down systematically all sorts of avenues of more localized political participation that existed in the country while they arrived, right? And I am not suggesting that there was some sort of fledgling trajectory toward like rural democracy that was scuttled by colonial rule. In many instances, right, something like the institution of elections for the Umda, for the village mayor, had actually been formalized under the Khedives, basically as part of a kind of political calculation that was tied up with their efforts to extract more and more and more taxes and other stuff out of the countryside. They were very unevenly implemented, and yet there were ideas that people in the countryside should enjoy some right to collective redress if the people governing them locally were doing bad things. And because of their ideas about the political incapacity of Egyptian peasants, the British immediately eliminated these forms of local elections as soon as they took over the provincial administration, with the result that basically electoral politics on subnational scales basically does not become a kind of widespread issue in Egypt again to this day, right? It's like Cairo as a city is utterly peculiar relative to other gigantic cities of its kind, in that, like, it does not have an elected mayor. And in fact, because of the provincial structure of Egypt, what is effectively the city of Cairo is governed under different governorates depending on which side of the Nile you're living on. So on the one hand, there's a kind of straightforward answer to your question, which just has to do with like actual political institutions and the way that they were transformed by the British. But in thinking through that history, I think part of what I'm naming politics in the countryside here has to do with like possible forms of collective deliberation and struggle around conditions of life. And one of the things that becomes quite striking in reading the gigantic archive of petitions that peasants all across the countryside continued to send to the government through this period is that they, and or the people that were writing the petitions on their behalf, seem to kind of operate under an assumption that they live in a world where there are going to be steep hierarchies of wealth and power, where there are going to be people around exploiting them and trying to do bad things to them. And that actually leads to a pretty keen sensitivity to how the institutions of the state are organized and to where the possibilities for some amount of maneuver around those structures of power might exist. And so, I mean, another thing that particularly the even-numbered chapters of the book are are trying to do is to kind of trace a history of how that institutional materiality of kind of possibilities for collective contestation of existing hierarchies of power move and shift and assume different forms.
Okay, I think that was a great answer. Left us on a very thoughtful note. I want to thank Shana Marshall for facilitating, and Aaron and Wael for such a rich conversation. And of course, please don't forget to use the flyer in the chat to order your copy of Egypt's Occupation, since we got such a great glimpse of the masterpiece that Aaron has written. And just want to remind you to join us for our next event on February 18th at noon with Benjamin White and Laura Robson, talking about refugees in Middle Eastern history, the Middle East and refugee history. Really looking forward to seeing you all again. And thank you so much on behalf of the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW. I'm Mona Ateya, and it's been a real pleasure to have both of you with us. So all of you with us. Thanks so much.